The sequence happened in a window of hours so compressed that the two events are inseparable from each other in every analysis that attempts to explain what destroyed the second round of Islamabad talks before it could begin. First came the ship, then came the statement. And the gap between the two was not measured in days or even in full hours. It was measured in the time it takes for Iranian state media to type a post on X and publish it to the world. On Sunday, April 19th, at some point during an afternoon that had already been escalating through Iranian gunboats firing on Indian vessels, a closed Strait of Hormuz, and an oil price climbing 7%, the United States Navy guided missile destroyer USS Spruance intercepted an Iranian-flagged cargo ship called the Tuska in the Gulf of Oman. The Spruance had been issuing warnings to the Tuska over a 6-hour period as the vessel continued toward the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas in violation of the naval blockade that had been in effect since April 13th. After 6 hours of ignored warnings, CENTCOM said the USS Spruance directed the vessel to evacuate its engine room. The ship did not comply. The Spruance then disabled the Tuska's propulsion by firing several rounds from its 5-inch Mark 45 gun into the engine room, blowing a hole through the hull of a 900-foot cargo vessel that was heading from China to Iran and was itself listed under United States Treasury sanctions for prior history of illegal activity. United States Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit boarded the non-compliant vessel. The Tuska came into American military custody in the Gulf of Oman. Trump posted about it on Truth Social with the specific satisfaction of a man who had just ordered an action he believed demonstrated something important. The Iranian crew refused to listen, he wrote. So our Navy ship stopped them right in their tracks by blowing a hole in the engine room. Right now, United States Marines have custody of the vessel. Then came the statement. Iran's official IRNA news agency published a post on X. It said Iran stated that its absence from the second round of talks stems from what it called Washington's excessive demands, unrealistic expectations, constant shifts in stance, repeated contradictions, and the ongoing naval blockade, which it considers a breach of the ceasefire. Under the present circumstances, there is no bright prospect for fruitful negotiations. The published news about the second round of negotiations in Islamabad is not true. The Tuska, then the statement, the ship seizure, then the cancellation. Between Trump blowing a hole in the engine room and Iran announcing there would be no second round of talks, the diplomatic architecture that Pakistan had spent 3 weeks constructing and that the entire world had been watching for signs of a deal collapsed in the specific gap between a military action and its political consequence. And as of Monday, April 20th, 2026, the morning after the most escalatory 48 hours since the conflict began on February 28th, J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner are on planes heading to Islamabad, while Iran's state news agency says no talks are happening, no Iranian delegation has confirmed attendance, and the ceasefire expires on Wednesday, April 22nd. By the end of this analysis, you're going to understand exactly why the Tuska seizure was not a miscalculation, but a deliberate military decision made inside the Saturday Situation Room meeting that Trump convened in the White House to discuss the Strait of Hormuz, and what that deliberateness means for every diplomatic possibility that still exists in the 48 hours before the ceasefire expires. Why Iran's cancellation statement is simultaneously a genuine hard stop and a calibrated diplomatic maneuver that Tehran's chief negotiator contradicted in the same news cycle it was published in. What the specific language of Iran's IRNA cancellation tells you about the precise conditions under which Iran would return to the table, and why the simultaneous presence of Vance's delegation flying to Pakistan and Iran's official statement that no talks are happening represents the single most important gap in this entire conflict, the gap between what both sides say publicly and what both sides need privately, whose resolution in the next 48 hours determines whether this war ends or resumes. Let us start with the decision to seize the Tuska, because the manner in which that decision was made reveals everything about the American strategic calculation that produced it. Trump convened a Situation Room meeting on Saturday morning, April 18th, according to 2 American officials who spoke to Axios. The meeting was convened specifically to discuss the renewed crisis around the Strait of Hormuz and negotiations with Iran. A senior American official told Axios that if there is no breakthrough soon, the war could resume in the coming days. The meeting included the people who run American military policy, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the intelligence and national security apparatus whose analysis was feeding the presidential decision-making process. This was not a spontaneous decision triggered by an individual ship's movements. The Saturday Situation Room meeting established the strategic context within which the Tuska intercept was authorized the following day. The 6-hour warning sequence that CENTCOM described was not a single sailor calling in for guidance. It was the operational execution of a policy decision that had been made at the highest level of the American government 12 to 24 hours before the first round was fired. The specific policy decision the Situation Room meeting produced was the escalation of blockade enforcement from turning ships away to physically disabling and seizing vessels. CENTCOM had previously directed 23 to 25 commercial vessels to turn around or return to Iranian ports. No vessel had previously been seized. No vessel had previously had its engine room shot out. The TUSCA was the deliberate selection of a higher enforcement threshold, chosen at a moment when the diplomatic track had simultaneously produced Iran's Friday Hormuz opening, Saturday gunboat firing on Indian ships, Iran's reversal of the Hormuz opening, and IRNA's Sunday cancellation statement about the second round of talks. The administration was watching the Iranian dual-track strategy operate in real time, diplomatic signals on one channel and IRGC military escalations on another, and the Situation Room meeting reached the conclusion that American enforcement needed to demonstrate a comparable willingness to escalate the military track in ways that the existing blockade enforcement had not. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had said publicly in his Thursday Pentagon briefing that United States forces will pursue Iran-linked ships in waters well outside the Middle East, and specifically mentioned the Indo-Pacific. He said, "If you do not comply with this blockade, we will use force." The TUSCA intercept was not a departure from policy. It was the literal execution of the publicly stated policy by the most senior military official in the American government. The ship ignored 6 hours of warnings. The use of force followed. American Central Command said forces acted in a deliberate, professional, and proportional manner to ensure compliance. From the American strategic perspective, the TUSCA seizure was a textbook enforcement action that demonstrated exactly the consequences the administration had publicly promised for noncompliance. From the Iranian strategic perspective, the TUSCA was a 900-foot cargo ship heading from China to Iran with an Iranian crew in international waters during a ceasefire. It was the first Iranian-flagged vessel to be physically seized and have its hull breached by American weapons fire in the entire 51-day conflict. Iranian military headquarters spokesperson Ebrahim Zolfagari went on state television and called it armed piracy. He said the United States violated the ceasefire by firing at an Iranian commercial vessel in the waters of the Sea of Oman, destroying the ship's navigational equipment and deploying what he specifically called terrorist marines on the deck of the vessel. The military announced that Iran would soon respond and retaliate. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Bakhayeh posted that the blockade itself is a violation of the ceasefire as well as an unlawful and criminal act, and that it amounts to a war crime and crime against humanity. And IRNA published the cancellation. The specific framing of IRNA's cancellation is worth reading in its exact published language because every word of it is a negotiating signal rather than a final position. Iran stated that its absence from the second round of talks stems from what it called Washington's excessive demands, unrealistic expectations, constant shifts in stance, repeated contradictions, and the ongoing naval blockade, which it considers a breach of the ceasefire. Under the present circumstances, the outlook for constructive talks remains bleak. The published news about the second round of negotiations in Islamabad is not true. It added that the news published by the United States is their media game and part of the blame game to pressure Iran. Note what IRNA did not say. It did not say Iran will never negotiate. It did not say the ceasefire framework is over. It did not say Iran is resuming hostilities. It said under present circumstances. Present circumstances include specifically the ongoing naval blockade. Change the present circumstances, specifically lift the blockade, and the conditions change. The absence from the second round stems from specific identified factors that are modifiable. This is diplomatic language designed to establish conditions for resumed talks rather than to permanently close the door. Iran is telling Washington, through IRNA's carefully constructed statement, exactly what needs to happen for the talks to resume. The blockade needs to end. The excessive demands need to become reasonable demands. The shifting stances need to become consistent positions. These are not the demands of a party that has decided to fight. They are the demands of a party that has decided to make the other side pay a higher cost to get them to the table. This reading is confirmed by what Golubov said on state television Saturday night, hours before the IRNA cancellation was published. He said some issues in the negotiations have been concluded, while others have not. There is still a distance to a final agreement. He also said something that deserves its full weight as a strategic declaration. He said there must be a guarantee that this cycle of war, ceasefire, and negotiation will not be repeated. That sentence is the Iranian chief negotiator describing not rejection, but conditions. He is not saying the negotiations are over. He is saying that Iran will not accept a framework that leaves it in the same position after the deal as it was in before, vulnerable to resumed American bombing, if any element of the agreement is contested, or if American political conditions change, as they did in 2018 when Trump walked away from the Obama-era nuclear deal. Golubov did also say, if the ceasefire is not implemented, we will not continue negotiations, and we will start the war. Those words are the hardest in the entire Saturday night address, but they are conditional. if the ceasefire is not implemented. The blockade is the American action that Iran considers to be non-implementation of the ceasefire. Lift the blockade and the condition changes. And every analysis of Iranian strategic behavior in this conflict supports the interpretation that Iran, whose military has suffered the assassination of its supreme leader, more than 13,000 airstrikes on its territory, and the physical seizure of its cargo ship in the Gulf of Oman, is not in a position it would describe as optimal for resuming full-scale war on Wednesday. The ceasefire is Iran's operational recovery window. Every day of the ceasefire is a day of tunnel excavation at Khomeini, new missile production, and air defense system deliveries from China. Ending the ceasefire, Wednesday eliminates that recovery window. Iran's interest in extending the window is real, even as its public position demands conditions for that extension that the American administration has so far refused to provide. Trump's response to the IRNA cancellation was the specific version of Trump that his advisors called deal-maker mode rather than threat mode. He said on Truth Social that the United States is giving diplomacy one last chance. He said if Iran does not sign this deal, it will be his honor to do what has to be done. He also said, my representatives are going to Islamabad, Pakistan. They will be there tomorrow evening for negotiations. That is Trump announcing negotiations that the other side has officially stated will not happen. This is the specific negotiating posture that has characterized the entire American approach to this conflict. State the favorable outcome publicly as if it has been agreed, in order to create the social and political pressure of apparent consensus that the other side must then either confirm or formally break from in a way that assigns diplomatic blame. Iran's IRNA responded by calling the American announcement a media game and a blame game to pressure Iran. This is accurate, and both sides know it is accurate. And both sides are continuing to do it because it is the only available mechanism for managing a negotiation where neither party can publicly acknowledge the concessions it is actually prepared to make, without triggering domestic political consequences from audiences that have been told those concessions are non-negotiable. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar spoke by phone with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi on Sunday, as the Tauska seizure was still being processed, and the IRNA cancellation was circulating on X. Pakistan's Foreign Ministry said Dar discussed with Araghchi the need for continued dialogue and engagement as essential to resolving the current issues as soon as possible. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian spoke by phone with Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif earlier on Sunday. PBS News reported that the ship seizure announcement came minutes after Iranian state media published the report on the Pezeshkian-Sharif call. These two pieces of information together tell a story about the specific moment at which the sequence of Tuska and cancellation intersected with Pakistani mediation. Pezeshkian was talking to Sharif about the continuation of diplomacy. Minutes after that call was publicized by Iranian state media, the Tuska seizure was announced. And shortly after the seizure was announced, IRNA published the cancellation statement. The sequencing suggests that the cancellation was Iran's institutional response not just to the broader pattern of the preceding days, but specifically to the Tuska seizure itself, issued as a direct consequence of the ship being taken, rather than as a predetermined position that existed before the seizure happened. The American official who told Axios that a senior American official said the war could resume in the coming days if there is no breakthrough was not speaking in hypothetical terms. The military buildup that aviation monitoring portal Flight Radar 24 had been tracking throughout the ceasefire period, American military equipment being transported to the Middle East at the same sustained levels as during active hostilities, describes an American military that is maintaining full operational readiness for resumed bombing, even as its diplomatic team boards planes to Islamabad. Hegseth said the military is locked and loaded on Iran's critical infrastructure. He said it is reloading with more power than ever before, and with better intelligence than ever before. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit that put personnel on the Tuska's deck is not the only American military asset that moved during the ceasefire period. The USS Gerald R., Ford Aircraft Carrier Task Group, the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS George H.W. Bush en route to the theater, and the guided missile destroyers that have been enforcing the blockade represent an American military posture that is configured for the resumption of combat operations at approximately the same level of intensity as Operation Epic Fury that launched the conflict on February 28th. The ceasefire expires Wednesday, April 22nd. That is 48 hours from Monday, April 20th. As of this analysis, the specific diplomatic picture is this. Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner are flying to Pakistan with no confirmed Iranian counterpart. Iran's official state news agency says no talks are scheduled and the reports of talks are a media game to pressure Iran. Iran's chief negotiator Ghalibaf says there is still a distance to a final agreement, and if the ceasefire is not implemented, the war will resume. Iran's military headquarters has promised retaliation for the Tauska seizure that may or may not have already occurred by the time this analysis is complete. No tankers crossed the Strait of Hormuz Sunday. Oil closed at $96.88 per barrel. American gasoline averaged $4.05 per gallon nationally, the highest of the conflict. The war has cost more than $200 billion in 51 days and more than 5,500 lives across Iran, Lebanon, Israel, and Gulf states. Trump's team is in the air. Iran says they will not be there. Pakistan is calling both sides. The ceasefire expires in 48 hours. The specific historical precedent that makes this moment comprehensible rather than simply chaotic is the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Not because the military technology or the geopolitical context is equivalent, but because the structural dynamic is identical. Two superpowers in a confrontation so dangerous that direct communication between them cannot acknowledge the concessions both sides are prepared to make without destroying the domestic political positions of both governments. A third-party communication channel operating in the gap between public statements and private necessities. A military escalation sequence happening simultaneously with a diplomatic negotiation sequence where each escalation changes the conditions under which the negotiation operates. And a deadline beyond which the confrontation transitions from managed escalation to unmanaged conflict. In October 1962, the deadline was the moment Soviet ships carrying missiles reached the American naval quarantine line. In April 2026, the deadline is Wednesday, April 22nd, at whatever hour the ceasefire agreement's 2-week term expires. The difference is that in October 62, there was a back channel that neither government acknowledged publicly through which the essential bargain was communicated. Nikita Khrushchev's secret communication through ABC News journalist John Scully to American officials. The specific offer that Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba if American missiles were removed from Turkey, a concession Kennedy was prepared to make but could not publicly acknowledge without appearing to have capitulated to Soviet pressure. The back channel allowed both sides to accept the essential terms without the public record showing either side had broken from its stated position. Pakistan is attempting to be that back channel for this conflict. The Pakistani army chief's visits to Tehran, the Pakistani prime minister's calls to Saudi Arabia, and Sharif's phone call with Pezeshkian hours before the IRNA cancellation statement. Pakistan's foreign minister Dar speaking to Aragchi while the Tuska seizure announcement was still reverberating. These are not diplomatic formalities. They are the specific communications through which the terms that both sides cannot publicly announce as acceptable are being evaluated for their private acceptability. Whether Pakistan can do in 48 hours what the Kennedy-Khrushchev back channel did in 13 days is the specific operational question that makes Monday, April 20th, the most consequential day of the entire conflict. The essential terms that both sides' private necessities require but neither can publicly announce are becoming visible through the gaps in their public statements. Iran cannot publicly announce it accepts a 20-year enrichment suspension, but Ghalibaf acknowledged that some issues in the negotiations have been concluded. The gap between the concluded issues and the remaining distance is where the deal lives if it exists. The United States cannot publicly announce it will lift the blockade as a precondition for talks, because that would be characterized as capitulating to Iranian pressure. But the Wall Street Journal reported that American officials are internally discussing whether the blockade should be modified as part of a framework that includes Iranian commitments on Hormuz access. The gap between the American stated position that the blockade continues until a deal is signed and the Iranian precondition that the blockade must end before talks resume is smaller than the public statements from both sides make it appear, because there is a possible middle position in which the blockade is modified or suspended for a defined period simultaneously with a second round of talks producing a preliminary framework. And the simultaneous timing means neither side can be characterized as having given a unilateral concession. Whether that middle position can be articulated through Pakistan's mediation channel in the hours between Monday morning and Wednesday's expiration is the diplomatic challenge that no analysis can resolve with certainty, because the resolution depends on decisions that are being made in real time by people operating under pressures that public information cannot fully characterize. Trump ordered the Marines to seize the Tuska. Tehran officially canceled the Pakistan talks. Vance is flying to Islamabad anyway. Iran's president called Pakistan's prime minister hours before the cancellation. Pakistan's foreign minister is calling Tehran. The strait is closed. The Tuska is in American custody. The IRGC has promised retaliation. Ghalibaf says the war will start if the ceasefire is not implemented. Trump says it will be his honor to do what has to be done if Iran does not sign. The ceasefire expires Wednesday. The gap between blowing a hole in the engine room and canceling the talks was hours. The gap between the cancellation and the ceasefire expiration is 48 hours. And the gap between what both sides say publicly and what both sides need privately is the specific distance that Pakistan's mediation, working through Sunday's calls and Monday's planes and whatever communications, are happening in channels that do not appear in IRNA posts or Truth Social updates is trying to close before Wednesday's clock runs out, and the sequence of Trump ordering Marines to seize an Iranian ship, Tehran canceling the talks, and Vance flying to Pakistan anyway, completes its arc in either a framework that extends the ceasefire and begins the process of ending the war, or in the resumption of the most economically destructive and diplomatically complex conflict in the Middle East since the Second Gulf War. The Marines have the Tuska, the IRNA has the cancellation, Vance has a plane to Islamabad, Iran has a military command that has promised to respond, Pakistan has a phone and a relationship with both sides. The ceasefire expires Wednesday, and the 51 days of this war have been narrowed to the specific 48 hours between the engine room shot and whatever Wednesday looks like when the clock stops.